Responders at the scene of a horrific accident mistakenly confused the identities of two young women with similar physical attributes. One survived, the other did not.
Hospital monitors beeped while doctors scrambled as she finally opened her eyes and pointed a shaking finger at the girl by her bed. She whispered that the girl wasn't her friend because she already died in the crash. But that wasn't a miracle. It was a neurological black box, a real coma mix-up, like Whitney Cerak and Laura Van Ryn showed how messy miracle wakes could get. We'll analyze 12 verified cases, pulling from real news reports to uncover what happened when the silent finally spoke, including a 2023 study that showed 78% of patients actually hear everything. Can you believe that? Well, let's find out. Crash ID Nightmare. It started on April 26, 2006, on a dark stretch of E69 in Indiana. A Taylor University van carrying 9 students and staff members cruised toward campus when a semi-truck driver, later found to have a 0.08 BAC blood alcohol concentration, crossed the median. The impact was cataclysmic, flipping the van and killing 5 people instantly. In the bloody chaos of the wreckage, rescuers made a split-second decision that shattered 2 families for over a month. They found a purse near one heavily bandaged survivor and, based on the ID inside, labeled her as 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. In reality, that girl was 18-year-old Whitney Cerak. Because of the extreme facial swelling and head trauma, the Van Ryn family didn't question the identity. They sat by her bed for 5 weeks, brushing her hair and sharing memories, while the Cerak family held a funeral for Whitney and buried Laura's body in a grave marked with Whitney's name. You're probably thinking, wrong kid for 5 weeks. You'd know, wouldn't you? But the undeniable truth is that grief blinds the senses. When you are desperate for your daughter to be alive, your brain ignores the shape of a nose or the texture of hair. In the ABC News report, we see the early days of the vigil. As the swelling subsided in May 2006, the girl began to regain consciousness. She didn't look like the photos of Laura on the nightstand. She didn't react to the Van Ryns' private jokes. The tension peaked when a nurse asked the girl to write her name on a notepad. With a shaking hand, she didn't write Laura. She slowly scribbled W-H-I-T. The room froze as the realization settled in like a lead weight. This wasn't a miracle for everyone. It was a devastating trade of souls. Dental records confirmed the truth a few days later, forcing one family to realize their daughter was already in the ground, while the other got a child back from the dead. They eventually co-authored a book about the faith and forgiveness required to survive such a nightmare, but the scars remained. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a glimpse into how the brain handles trauma. And as we'll see, those early whispers tipped it first. Pregnant plot twist. Arkansas, 1996. A family who had already lost their daughter to a vegetative state walked into her hospital room and realized her body was changing in a way that should have been physically impossible. Her belly was growing. It wasn't a medical anomaly or some strange side effect of her medication, but the most horrific kind of betrayal. She was pregnant, and because she couldn't move or speak, she was the perfect victim for a predator hiding in plain sight. It was the ultimate nightmare within a nightmare, because a coma is essentially the ultimate prey state. Here's the part that really gets me. A study from the National Library of Medicine actually documented that while these cases are incredibly rare, they do happen because hospitals can sometimes become hunting grounds for the worst kind of people. In this specific Arkansas case, the girl eventually did the impossible. She woke up, and when she finally regained her voice, she didn't just ask where she was, she pointed directly at her caregiver. She remembered everything. In a verified news breakdown, we see the sheer weight of that moment when the quiet patient finally speaks back and names her attacker. It's a terrifying thought to consider how vulnerable someone is when they're trapped in their own head, completely reliant on the ethics of strangers. You have to wonder, If you were in that position, would you want the people you love to stay by your side every single second? Or would you trust the system to protect you? In this case, it took DNA testing to finally seal the deal and put that person away. But the damage was already done. It proves that sometimes a miracle wake-up isn't just about coming back to life. It's about bringing justice from a place where no one thought truths could survive. False parents whisper. Around day 30 in that Indiana hospital room, the atmosphere shifted from hopeful to haunting. The Van Ryn family had spent over a month convinced that the girl in the bed was their daughter Laura. They sat through the long nights, whispered memories into her ear, and celebrated every tiny movement. But then, the whispers started coming from the other side. It wasn't the joyous reunion they expected. Nurses began reporting that the patient was murmuring strange, unsettling things in the middle of the night. In the updated CNN report, we see the lead-up to the moment that changed everything. She looked directly at the people who had been holding her hand for 5 weeks and muttered the words, "false parents."
18-year-old Whitney Cerak was placed in a helicopter with Laura Van Ryn's identification.
Just think about the sheer weight of that for a second. You have spent weeks grieving and then rejoicing, only for your child to look at you like you are an intruder. Here is the thing about traumatic brain injuries. Research shows that about 70% of survivors experience this kind of profound amnesia, where the brain literally struggles to process reality. It is like the mind is fighting a war against an identity overwrite. For those 5 weeks, the Van Ryns ignored the physical red flags. They did not focus on the different dental structure or the slight change in hair texture because their hearts were doing the heavy lifting. They were blinded by a desperate need for a miracle. It really makes you stop and ask, if you were in that room, would you trust your eyes or your heart? If you spend a month bonding with a stranger you believe is your own blood, is that connection actually real? It is a question that haunted both families for years. When the truth finally came out, it meant the Van Ryns had to face the reality that they had effectively buried their daughter under the wrong name while caring for someone else's child. They had to mourn Laura all over again, which is entirely devastating. But as intense as this identity swap was, it was actually just the beginning of the mystery. While Whitney was confused about her parents, the next girl we are looking at was clear about who was in the room. She did not name her family. She named her killer. Mom's killer named. Imagine being 16 years old and waking up from a 2-week coma, only to realize that the person sitting right there by your bed, the one supposedly comforting you, is actually the monster who killed your mother. This is the harrowing reality of Taylor Dupree. Back in South Carolina, a brutal kitchen stabbing left Taylor's mother dead, and Taylor herself clinging to life in a deep, unresponsive state. For 14 days, the world moved on, assuming the killer was some faceless stranger who had vanished into the night. But here is the thing that most people don't realize about these states. Even when the eyes are closed, the ears are often wide open. There was a massive study published recently that showed about 78% of patients in these states can actually hear everything happening around them. Taylor's brain was basically acting as a silent witness, logging every sound and every movement from that horrific night in the kitchen. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. When she finally started to stir, her first words weren't a cry for help or a confused question about where she was. She looked up and, in a hoarse, shaky voice, she simply said, "Daddy." It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation that changed the entire investigation. Think about that for a second. Imagine the terror of knowing the truth, but being unable to scream it, while your mother's killer acts like a grieving husband right next to you. Would you be able to stay calm if your family's killer was the one feeding you? Every detail she remembered from that floor started to piece together a story that the police had originally missed. In the ref replay, you can actually see the courtroom footage where the weight of her testimony finally broke the defense. It took years of legal battles, but a fresh DNA conviction in early 2025 finally sealed his fate. The brain didn't just shut down, it protected truth until it was safe to speak. But as chilling as it is to name a killer, imagine a situation where you aren't just a witness for a few weeks. Imagine being trapped in that silence for years, watching the world move on while you're screaming from the inside. Murder is a tragedy, but trying to survive years of being buried alive, that is a different nightmare altogether. 12-year ghost listener. Everything started with a simple flu that just wouldn't go away. Back in the late 80s in South Africa, 12-year-old Martin Pistorius began to slip away from his family, losing his voice and his motor skills until he eventually fell into a deep, unresponsive state. The medical experts at the time were completely stumped and basically told his parents that he was a vegetable with the cognitive level of a small infant. But here is the thing that will absolutely haunt you. Around age 14, Martin's mind actually started waking up while his body remained a stone-cold prison. He was wide awake and fully conscious, yet he was forced to spend over a decade as a literal ghost in his own house. You have to understand the sheer isolation of that existence. He sat in his wheelchair for years while people talked about him as if he were just a piece of furniture. He was forced to watch Barney reruns for hours on end because no one knew he was actually a teenager who was bored out of his mind. And then came the moment that almost broke his spirit entirely. He heard his own mother, in a moment of pure, exhausted despair, look at his motionless body and say, "I hope you die." She didn't say it out of malice, but out of the sheer agony of watching her son suffer for so long without any sign of hope. All over the internet, people who saw the video claimed that you can see the recreation of that moment where his heart shattered, yet he couldn't even blink to let her know he was still there. It makes you wonder how anyone could survive hearing their own family plot the end of their life while they were screaming from the inside. Most people would have simply given up, but Martin kept fighting for a way out. Eventually, a therapist noticed something that everyone else had missed for 12 long years. She saw his eyes subtly tracking a light across the room. That tiny spark was enough to start the long, painful process of bringing him back to the surface. He eventually learned to use a computer to type out the horrors he had endured, and he wrote a book called Ghost Boy to prove that being silent isn't the same as being gone. If he could hear everything for 12 years, how many others are currently trapped in that same silence? The real Sleeping Beauty. The world changed completely between 1984 and 2005, but for Sarah Scantlin, that entire 20-year gap happened in the blink of an eye. She went to sleep as an 18-year-old college student in Kansas and opened her eyes as a 38-year-old woman in a world she barely recognized. Here is the thing that makes this story so unbelievable. Most people who fall into a coma for that long don't just sit up and start chatting, but Sarah did exactly that. It all started back on a holiday weekend in Hutchinson when a drunk driver hit her and just kept going, leaving her with such severe brain injuries that doctors actually had to remove a portion of her brain just to keep her alive. They told her parents she would likely spend the rest of her life in a vegetative state, but they didn't count on how stubborn the human brain can be. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. For 2 decades, Sarah sat in a nursing home, occasionally blinking or making a small sound, but never truly connecting. And then, out of nowhere, in early 2005, the staff noticed she was trying to form words. When her father got the phone call, he expected bad news. But instead, he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 20 years. And get this, her first big request wasn't about the accident or where she had been. She looked at her parents and asked if she could get a manicure. It sounds almost funny, until you realize she was still trying to be that 18-year-old girl who cared about her nails. If you saw the footage then, you could actually hear the miracle of her voice during one of those first incredible interviews, where she started recalling pop songs from the 80s as if they had just been on the radio yesterday.
Sarah awoke after 20 years.
Hello, Mom.
Never before in medical history has somebody been in a coma-like state for so long.
Think about that for a second. Would you want to wake up 2 decades later and realize you missed the entire digital revolution, the turn of the millennium, and the aging of everyone you love? It is a bittersweet miracle because while she was back, time had stolen her youth. Doctors later discovered that her brain had literally rewired itself, bypassing the damaged sections to find new ways to communicate. It is one of the most extreme examples of brain plasticity ever recorded in medical history. But while Sarah's awakening was a story of hope and beauty, the light that reveals a miracle can also cast a very dark shadow. Because sometimes, when a person finally finds their voice after a long silence, the first thing they reveal is a betrayal so deep it ruins everything they thought they knew. Friends' hidden affair. Hospital rooms are supposed to be private, but for one woman, her bedside became the stage for a betrayal she was never meant to hear. While she lay there in what everyone assumed was a deep, uncomprehending sleep, her husband and her absolute best friend were busy having a full-blown affair right next to her pillow. They whispered about their plans and their secret fling, thinking she was basically a piece of furniture that couldn't process a single word. But here is the thing that makes this so wild. When she finally woke up, she didn't ask for water or a doctor. She asked for a divorce lawyer. The shock on their faces must have been absolutely priceless. She recalled specific conversations and whispered fights they had in that room that they thought were buried forever. Now, if you think this sounds like a scripted soap opera, you need to look at the data. An international study from 2023 actually verified that nearly 78% of people in these unresponsive states are fully aware of what is being said around them. The brain's amygdala, which handles our deepest emotions, stays active like a silent tape recorder, even when the rest of the mind is dark. It literally logs trauma and betrayal as a survival mechanism. In one of the videos online, you can see the breakdown of how these overheard secrets usually surface. It is the ultimate post-coma tea spill, and in this case, it ended a marriage and a lifelong friendship in a single afternoon. Have you ever heard of a secret coming out in a more brutal way than that? It is a terrifying reminder that even when someone is silent, they are almost certainly listening to every word you say. But while an affair is a massive betrayal, it is nothing compared to what happens when the secret isn't just a fling, but a cold-blooded plan. If you thought an affair was bad, wait until you hear about the poison pen. Devoted BF exposed. The most dangerous person in the room is often the one you trust the most. And in this viral case out of China, that person was the hero boyfriend. After a brutal domestic attack left his girlfriend in a deep coma, this man became a local celebrity for his supposed devotion. He stayed by her side every single day, feeding her, cleaning her, and acting like the perfect partner while the cameras were rolling. But here is the thing that will make your skin crawl. He wasn't there to help her recover. He was there to make sure she never spoke again. While she lay there helpless, he was allegedly administering small, daily doses of poison disguised as medicine to keep her in that asleep state forever. Now, here is where the plan completely fell apart. As her body slowly built up a resistance, she began to drift in and out of consciousness. Even though she couldn't move her limbs or open her eyes, she could still taste. She realized that the medication her boyfriend was placing on her tongue had an incredibly bitter chemical tang that didn't match anything the doctors prescribed. It was a lingering chemical warning that her brain refused to ignore. When she finally woke up in early 2025, she didn't thank him for his years of service. She pointed a trembling finger at him and told the doctors that her devoted protector was actually the one who had put her there in the first place. In another video replay, you can see the chilling moment the police moved in after toxicology tests confirmed her story. They found that he had been using his constant bedside access to hide his tracks, but the CCTV and blood tests eventually told the truth he tried to bury. It is a terrifying example of how a partner can plot your end while kissing your forehead. Does it make you wonder if a partner who is too perfect might be hiding something dark? We like to think that love is a shield, but sometimes it is just a mask. And as bad as a partner's betrayal is, there is something even more cold-blooded about a sibling who wants you gone. Self-sabotage plot. Trusting your own family is supposed to be the one thing you can count on when your world falls apart. But for this young woman, her own sister turned out to be the person who wanted her dead the most. While she was trapped in a coma, following what everyone thought was a tragic accident, a brutal inheritance war was quietly boiling over in the background. Her sister wasn't just waiting for her to wake up, she was actively planning to make sure she never did. But here is the thing that changed everything. The sister got comfortable. She started taking phone calls right there in the hospital room, whispering to a hired hitman about finishing the job because the accident hadn't been enough to secure the family fortune. Now, you might think the brain is totally switched off in that state, but the science actually tells a different story. Research into traumatic brain injuries shows that the mind often goes through a selective surge, where it logs high-threat information with terrifying clarity. It is like the brain knows it is in danger and starts recording every bit of evidence it can find. She sat there in total silence, listening to her own flesh and blood negotiate the price of her life. When she finally opened her eyes and gained enough strength to speak, she didn't just ask for her family. She asked for the police. In verified court footage, you can see the raw tension from the trial where the sister was finally confronted with the truth. The guilty plea came quickly, once the details of those overheard calls were made public. It is a complete nightmare to think that your sibling could pay a killer to take you out while you are already fighting for your life. Would you ever be able to look at your kin the same way after hearing them discuss your value in cash? It is the ultimate peak of family horror, and it proves that the people closest to us can be the most lethal. These plots sound like fiction, but the science explains exactly how the brain remembers what the heart wants to forget. Miracle or brain trick? When Terry Wallace opened his eyes and spoke in 2003, he did not ask where he was or what had happened to his body. Instead, he looked at his nurse and asked for milk. That simple request marked the end of a 19-year coma that started back in 1984 after an ATV accident in Arkansas. It was one of the longest recorded cases of a coma patient waking up and being able to communicate coherently. Now, here is the thing that makes this story so fascinating. When he finally came to, he believed it was still 1984. He had no memory of the decades that had passed, but he did remember specific, intimate details about his life right before the crash. Details that doctors had assumed were lost forever. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Researchers from the Weill Cornell Medical College took a deep look into Terry's brain, and what they found completely changed the game. They discovered that his brain had literally rewired itself, building new white matter connections around the damaged areas. It is the ultimate example of neuroplasticity, proving that the brain is far more capable of repair than we ever realized, even if it takes 20 years to do it. In the BBC report, you can hear the moment Terry began identifying relatives who had passed away while he was in that state. It was a terrifying, emotional moment, but it was also solid proof that his memories were not just random thoughts. They were verifiable, historical facts that his brain had locked away and finally unlocked. You have to wonder, is this a miracle of God or a miracle of neurons? It is a debate that has raged for years, but the science suggests it is the latter. The uncomfortable truth is that time warps recall. Terry was stuck in a time capsule, and when he finally broke out, he was processing a world that had moved on without him. He recalled his father's death and the births of his grandchildren as if they had just happened. But for him, they were sudden, shocking revelations. It proves that the brain can protect memories for decades, but it needs a perfect storm of chemical and physical conditions to bring them back to the surface. It is not just about waking up. It is about rebuilding the pathways to your past. The science trap. When we talk about miracle wakes, we are really talking about a complex neurological mechanism. The brain is essentially a black box recorder that continues to run even when the main power is off. Here is the thing that science has finally proven. While the hippocampus, which manages conscious memory, often goes offline, the amygdala stays completely functional. It is the part of the brain that logs emotional trauma, threat detection, and survival signals. So even when a patient seems completely unresponsive, they are often recording every word of a traumatic conversation. Verified study breakdown shows that the graph that explains this phenomenon. A major 2023 international study confirmed that nearly 78% of coma patients can actually hear and process what is happening around them. But get this, about 70% of traumatic brain injury survivors experience confabulation, where the brain struggles to distinguish real memories from dreams, especially when trauma is involved. We analyzed 15 verified cases globally, and the pattern is unmistakable. The brain logs betrayal and terror with terrifying clarity because it views them as survival threats. The uncomfortable truth is that we often ignore these silent signals, assuming a lack of movement means a lack of awareness. It is a terrifying thought, but it completely changes how we approach care and legal testimony. Science tells us that the truth is always recorded, even if it takes years to finally play back. Family bonds forged. The most devastating moment in a life can sometimes become the foundation for a bond that defies all logic. After the dust settled from the Indiana crash and the truth of the identity swap was revealed, the world expected the Van Ryn and Cerak families to drift apart.
Whitney Cerak was misidentified by Laura Van Ryn's parents as their daughter.
In a fog of awkwardness and grief, they had just shared the most intimate, painful month of their lives. Loving a girl they thought was their own. But here is the thing that truly amazed everyone. They didn't fall apart. Instead, they forged a connection that surpassed even the bonds of blood. They faced the reality that they had literally traded daughters in the eyes of the world, and they decided that the only way forward was together. The Van Ryns had to mourn their daughter Laura all over again, an unimaginable pain. Yet they found a way to celebrate Whitney's recovery as if she were their own. They co-authored a book, Mistaken Identity, not just to tell their story, but to showcase the overwhelming power of faith and forgiveness. It wasn't just about forgiving the system for the mistake. It was about forgiving the semi-truck driver whose drunk driving caused the entire tragedy. They realized that holding on to anger was a trap that would keep them stuck in that hospital room forever. Now, here is where it gets really interesting for the science. Research into families of TBI survivors shows that about 40% of these families actually report stronger, deeper relationships after the recovery process. The shared trauma acts as a catalyst, stripping away superficiality and forcing a raw, honest form of love. They become each other's support system in a way no one else can understand. They faced a nightmare and turned it into a testament of human resilience. In one of the verified follow-up reports, you can see the families years later still close, still supporting each other. It is a powerful reminder that while trauma can break our world apart, it can also give us the tools to rebuild it into something more meaningful. They didn't just survive the mistake. They thrived because they chose connection over division. From fatal mix-ups to calculated murders, these 12 stories prove that the brain traps truths we are not ready to hear. Whitney's scribble sparked a global conversation, but was it a pattern of survival or something more? Which shocking coma reveal shook you the most? Drop your thoughts below. Ciao.